Thank you all for joining us on today's webinar, a webinar where we will speak to the growing landscape of global regulations as it pertains to supply chain transparency, how mitigating and managing risk truly is handled by an end-to-end solution, and how approaching this issue the correct way can steer you away from negative business practices and even bigger risks. My name is Devin Simonson, and I'm from Source Intelligence, and I will be presenting today alongside our partner Caspar Fithen with Martello Risk. Before we get started, we have some quick items to go over. All slides and videos of this webinar will be available shortly after we conclude at sourceintelligence.com. Additionally, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the GoToWebinar control panel. We will send a follow-up email with responses after the webinar and set some time aside for some one-on-one conversations to get into further detail on the questions that you submit. Here's a quick look at today's agenda. We will be covering risk identification and mitigation, followed by regulatory compliance as it relates to the Middle East, the political and security risks to be aware of, also implementing a supply chain compliance program, an end-to-end process, and how such a process can impact your business operations in a positive way, and lastly, how technology plays a significant role in the growing global regulatory landscape. First, we will hear from Dr. Caspar Fithen, founder and director of operations for Martello Risk. A brief background on Dr. Fithen and Martello Risk. They conduct upstream third-party supply chain audits for international companies that include areas from South America to the Middle East. With over 20 years experience working on the political economy of extractive industries in affected areas, much of it undertaken in the field, Caspar Fithen is an internationally acknowledged expert on the management of natural resources. Caspar also holds a Ph.D. in the conflict economy of West African diamond trade from the University College London. Again, my name is Devin Simonson. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Source Intelligence. I've been involved many years building cloud-based systems to optimize operational efficiencies for industry leaders. I've created solutions for global brands managing their third-party business partners, and I've been involved with the technology industry for the past 8 years. I hold a bachelor's degree from California State University Northridge and have earned my master's degree from the San Diego State University. Now that we've gone over the introductions, let's go ahead and proceed with the webinar. Caspar?
Thank you very much, Devin. I will now go on to say something about the capabilities of Martello Risk and what we do in the upstream of the supply chain, and how what Martello does knits with the capabilities of Source Intelligence. We're working within a context of increasing global legislation. The legislation is in the US in the form of Dodd-Frank 1502. We've got forthcoming European Union legislation, and legislation is being introduced in China for manufacturers there as well. Now, with regard to end-to-end, we believe that end-to-end means from the place where a mineral is extracted from the ground to the point that it enters the manufacturing supply chain and travels down to the consumer. What we see is the problem with current legislation across the board, both in Europe and Dodd-Frank and in China, is that there is an issue with regard to the depth of the due diligence that is undertaken, and often it only runs as far upstream as the smelters. We are of the firm opinion, garnered through lots of experience in the region and with supply chains in the upstream, that the most of the risk to companies in fact exists between the smelters and the mines. These are the bits that are deep in remote areas and are often outside the scrutiny of both the state and the state in these producing countries. The authority of the state in these producing countries is often limited outside the capital cities, and also the scrutiny of NGOs and the international community. So what we do is, as Martello Risk, is provide independent third-party supply chain audits on this area. And we provide the clarity across upstream supply chains by conducting audits and investigations. We also audit mines in even most remote areas, as well as smelters, the brokers, the wholesalers, the exporters, ensuring that everybody conforms to the OECD standards. Now, just to give you an example of what that really means, when working for the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, for whom we are one of only 3 independent auditors accredited by them, for instance, we might be working in Rwanda, and in order to visit a mine in Rwanda, typically one hops into a 4-wheel drive in Kigali, the capital, and within an hour and a half, 2 hours, we're at the mine. We can conduct audits over a 2 to 3 day period, and then we're back to the capital, and the job is done. When we're operating in places like Eastern DRC, a typical audit could last for a month, simply because of the size of the country, the lack of infrastructure, and the difficulty of getting round. And that often means traveling for days, 8 hours a day often, on motorbikes along paths because there are no roads, crossing large rivers in boats and so forth. But we believe that this is the only way that we can actually get the level and depth of information with regard to the upstream for our clients. Now, the cross-sectional risks in the upstream supply chain include money laundering, terrorist financing, arms trade financing, conflict in the Middle East, conflict in Asia, the Latin American illicit drug trade, money laundering, violations of various sanctions, both United States sanctions, United Nations and European Union, environmental degradation, and of course human rights abuses, including forced resettlement and child labour. So what this represents to our clients is, and I should say, reiterate that this doesn't only apply to minerals, this applies to a number of other commodities as well, but it represents reputational risk, ethical commitment risk, legal risk, political, financial, and environmental risk. In other words, any company lacks control over its supply chain is operating in the dark unless it has full assurance of the security of its far upstream supply chain. And if a company is not monitoring this closely, you can be sure that others are, particularly if your company is a global brand. And the sort of people who will be monitoring the supply chain will be NGOs, civil society groups, law enforcement, sanctions regimes, and legislative framework monitors, both national, regional, and international. So just to recap, where we think that Martello Risk can help clients in the Middle East is really, in addition to the environmental and social risks, and indeed the sustainability risks, there are also political and security risks linked to the supply chain. Now, where this is important is that these issues of supply chain due diligence will mean a great deal to partnering oil and gas and mineral extraction companies that are working with Middle Eastern companies, particularly if those companies are either based in the United States or in the European Union or in China. So again, just looking at those risks, some of the suppliers to the sector could be supplying material, equipment, or financing terrorist organizations. Suppliers could be linked to arms groups. Some of the suppliers could be sanctioned by the UN or the US. There could also be suppliers who are involved in or linked to corruption, or there could be suppliers who are known or suspected to be involved in money laundering or criminal activities. Ultimately, the security and assurance over the supply chain that we can offer brings strength and control to a company in the Middle East and its supply chain. And in the long term, this brings added value to share pricing. It brings opportunity for partnerships with large oil and gas companies or other extractive industries in Europe or in the US or in China. And in the long term, this brings added value to the share price.
Thank you, Caspar, for sharing your insights on how to mitigate risks, specifically when working alongside organizations within the Middle East and the surrounding areas. It's so great to have Caspar here today as a co-presenter. We are always happy to bring in industry leaders on webinars and also to have Martello Risk as a trusted partner. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today as well on behalf of Source Intelligence to talk about supply chain implementation and how technology can tremendously impact such pressing topics. and how discussing how a true supply chain transparency program has multiple functions and when properly put together can create an end-to-end solution. As we develop sustainable programs for identifying and mitigating supply chain risks, we can begin to achieve supply chain transparency and ultimately affect ethical and social change in the supply chain. So what does that mean for you? Ultimately, this means regardless of the risks, because of course there's always going to be risks, you have the option to move forward with global opportunities and be well aware of the risks with an end-to-end solution. So today, we are discussing specifically end-to-end supply chain due diligence and the keys to developing a robust program. There are many pieces to this puzzle, but before you begin crafting the perfect picture, you need to understand where the potential risks are, of course, where they live in your supply chain. Technology can help support that in many ways. I will walk you through the process, what it looks like, what we think will give you the best practices through means of technology for identifying risks, and how to use technology to partner with auditors to have the best robust and cost-effective compliance program. So, if it is not obvious, an effective end-to-end supply chain compliance program starts with an effective strategy. I will share with you best practices that come from Source Intelligence's supply chain compliance platform that was designed in partnership with our global enterprise clients over the past few years, which is based on a proactive compliance strategy for substance-based product regulations and ethical sourcing standards. The goal of this process, and what should be the goal of any process you develop, is to have an active library of regulations if your concerns are with the global regulatory initiatives, or if your focus is more specific and hovers over product level reporting, then having an active library of substances for your products and their identifying concentration levels will and can help you be proactively comparing any number of current, changing, and emerging worldwide regulations or industry imposed restrictions. The process of actively managing the regulations that impact your industry and or substances in your products has proven to be advantageous for many companies, as you all likely know. If you work in the world of compliance, you face this on a consistent basis. Either the new product regulatory requirements, such as the new labeling requirements coming from the Prop 65, California Prop 65 as an example, or the additions of the new ROS EU regulation, or simply put, you and the company may face a new regulation altogether that you have to understand and need the resources to understand them. Once you have defined and set your strategy as proactive, your technology-based supply chain compliance process starts by communicating your corporate policies to the supply chain. If you do not have set policies, what standards are part of your company's compliance and social responsibility program? There are multitudes of regulations and standards that are driving companies to engage their supply chain. You will need to identify those relevant to your company and distribute the policies. You will then need to gather and verify your data to map your supply chain. Your data and the data you collect during the duration of your compliance program initiatives will be clear indicators of what is in your supply chain and where some of the risks lie. Dependent on the needs of the company and the forward-thinking activities surrounding your compliance initiatives, you'll need to send out multiple forms of documents that may include your annual code of conduct policies, TNCs, and a host of other document types that will need to be signed and returned. In addition, you may have your own restricted substances list or policy and contract manufacturing agreements covering issues like chemical compliance and quality control documents that will need to be exchanged with your supply chain. Implementing a comprehensive supply chain due diligence program based off of technology and other resources will include data collection for chemical compliance, but also ethical sourcing initiatives. Human trafficking, anti-corruption, and security protocol declarations, as an example, are covered in terms of document management and analysis. Of course, with data coming in and the ability to use technology alongside physical on-site verification, the due diligence process on your supply chain can be as transparent as your data makes it to be. When you're working with so many forms of data, regulations, and standards, data collection can hinder companies from progressing in their supply chain compliance programs. Some best practices we have found from collecting documents from over 300,000 suppliers include our multilingual supplier engagement team greatly impacts our ability to make contact and collect necessary supply chain data, so communication in your supply chain's language. Be available to engage with your suppliers during their working hours. We operate 24/7, 7 days a week, business operations centers, so when questions come in, we can help guide or educate our network of suppliers. When it is easy for all tiers of the supply chain to exchange information, you get the information you need to make data collection and sharing easy for your suppliers. And this is pivotal as we see that the technology that we provide is really impacting and enabling a lot of suppliers within multiple industry supply chains. One way to ease the burden of your suppliers is to provide them with training and education on the regulations and standards, a part of your company's supply chain compliance strategy. What this enables is for a more efficient business operation. If a supplier has to learn about a regulation or standard on their own, responses could be delayed or may never come at all, and of course resulting in a slower business process and more exposure to more risk. We keep an audit trail of all the communications and interactions. We warehouse this, of course, on our platform to enable both the consumer, the customer, and the suppliers to exchange information when need be. Since Source Intelligence has a growing network of suppliers, updating their profiles, responding to multiple client requests is very easy. However, I understand if you're not using a solution that has this capability, reducing supplier fatigue may be a little bit more challenging. Once you have supply chain data, you will need to put it through a risk screening. In order for you to have a operationally effective and yet cost-effective supply chain compliance program, you will need to strategically build deeper verification efforts into your process. Although there is a level of due diligence built into the data collection process that will likely satisfy many compliance requirements, we are finding that there is actually a need for deeper verification for certain suppliers and certain supplier data dependent on the circumstances. As a part of your corporate policy, you should determine the level of risk that is acceptable for each standard or regulation. If your policy for human trafficking, for example, in your supply chain is zero tolerance, and one of your suppliers is sourcing from a higher risk country, you should rate and track that level of risk or use the data that is provided to make a determination in finding another supplier in a lower risk region. Listed are some of the risks you could incur: incomplete data, missing information, banned substances, high levels of chemical reported, or quality issues. Mitigating risk with a basis set on technology in your supply chain starts by getting this clear view. And the outcome of the risk analysis can take you in different directions. You should decide if suppliers not flagged as high risk move on to the approval process or go back to the reoccurring risk screening, whether that may be biannual or other desired frequencies. You could eliminate this step altogether and move all suppliers forward to a secondary level, a formal risk assessment, if that is manageable. A formal risk assessment is another supplier information request. On the SI platform, it can be automated. Once again, your company will likely have different succession plans for different regulations and standards. Keep in mind, for standards that could be consumer-facing, multiple levels of risk assessments are recommended so that the suppliers you work with do not put your brand reputation at risk. As incoming responses are scored according to your risk weighting and scoring schema, you would determine if the supplier has inadequate risk controls and decide if this rises to the level of on-site audit needed or if moving back to a recurring screening is sufficient. Implementing a risk screening process will enable your company to prioritize on-site audits with only limited resources. Again, enabling your suppliers and yourselves through the platform and through technology. At the end of the day, what does this mean for you, your supply chain, and your company's brand? Well, ultimately, the goal is to have a complete understanding and awareness of your supply chain, even if the results of your data conclude that you have a multitude of different exposure points. To recap, what you see here is truly what we call an end-to-end solution that embraces the ability to gather, define, screen, and analyze all kinds of supplier data, while pinpointing the larger risk areas that an audit will ultimately determine. As I mentioned before, not all compliance initiatives will have the same urgency as others and will require a rescreening process for more validated data or an enhanced corrective action plan that will both clean your supply chain and minimize your exposure to the risk. To wrap up, I just want to say that we had some great presentations coming today. Again, we want to say thank you to Martello Risk and Caspar for sharing with us their extensive knowledge on supply chain risk as it pertains to the Middle East. As a reminder, if you joined us late today, we will have a recording of this webinar and the slides available on our website at sourceintelligence.com. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me at education@sourceintelligence.com or directly at dsimonson@sourceintelligence.com. Any of the questions that were asked during the webinar will be received and responded shortly after this webinar today. If you're looking for more information, please check out our upcoming white paper library or webinar libraries that are also on our website. This is Devin Simonson with Source Intelligence. Again, thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.